Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. The Metropolitan Opera, a centerpiece of New York cultural life, has weathered a parade of challenges throughout its 140-year history. The opera's modern success in overcoming financial constraints, temperamental reigning divas, stormy union negotiations, a 2-year shutdown because of COVID, and recently, a devastating cyberattack which crippled its box office for 9 days, is largely due to Peter Gelb, for almost 2 decades its resilient and innovative general manager. The Metropolitan Opera always seems to bounce back, and we're pleased to have Peter Gelb back with us to tell us exactly how he does it. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to think I'm not responsible for all of those calamities, but
I think I said largely responsible.
But this is now my 17th season as general manager of the Met, so I've weathered a lot of storms.
A lot of storms, and I congratulate you on that. You're a New York treasure. Now, one of the interesting things that's arisen recently at the opera is your convincing advocacy of Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. And one would think of the opera as kind of apolitical, neutral in world events, maybe a bright star in the night. But what accounts for your support of Ukraine and how it evolved?
Well, certainly, theatrically, we're not neutral in the sense that I engage directors to and commission operas that can be about subjects that are political or potentially controversial to one party or another. But my position as the head of the Met has been to mostly steer a clear, neutral course politically, since the Met relies upon funding from both sides of the aisle, at least in terms of our donor population. And I was advised early on in my career that I should try to avoid politics, at least when I'm speaking about situations, as much as possible. However, in the case of Ukraine, that's a very different situation. I mean, here we are at war with Russia, maybe having not directly declared war, but from all practical purposes, we are at war. And the opera being, the art form of opera, and the Met being at the center of that art form, is a very international activity. I mean, and Russia has long played a key role in the world of opera, particularly since the Iron Curtain came down. Many of the greatest singers populating our stages here and around the world are from Eastern Europe and from Russia. And in fact, the Met has collaborated with Russian cultural institutions like the Bolshoi and the Vervinsky on co-productions. Under my watch over the past 17 years, and in recent years, I had developed a close working relationship with the Bolshoi, in fact. I didn't see any way the Met could possibly be neutral in a situation where Putin, declared this horrible war of oppression and invaded Ukraine. And I think that for cultural leaders and just as political leaders, we have to take a position. We can't allow the world to be destroyed by this monster. And opera and culture is maybe not the center of the war, but it's certainly a part of the war.
Well, that was your conviction and your moral conviction, but how did you go about implementing it?
Well, the way I went about implementing it, we're getting close now to the 1-year anniversary of the invasion on February 24th. I was actually in Moscow 2 days before the invasion to attend the final dress rehearsal of what was supposed to be a co-production of Wagner's opera Lohengrin that actually is opening at the Met in February. While I was there was a lot of talk about the potential of the invasion. But it wasn't until I got off the plane flying back to New York the day later, arriving on the 24th, that the invasion had begun. And I immediately just reversed everything we were doing with Russia. Not everything, but everything that had to do with Russia, subsidies, government subsidized institutions, and any artists who had close personal ideological ties to Putin. So we just stopped doing business with Russia in terms of those aspects of our relationships. I mean, the work with the Bolshoi stopped. We had to go and often build our own scenery and costumes instead of having them shipped from Russia. Had we wanted to have them shipped, they wouldn't have been allowed to be shipped anyway because of the sanctions that would soon take place. But long before any sanctions were announced, we created our own sanctions. We said we would not do business with the Bolshoi, we would not do business with Putin. And at the same time, not only we didn't stop there, we also actively went to war, I mean, culturally, against Russia on the side of Ukraine by supporting Ukrainian artists and making our, within a couple of days of the invasion, we were playing the Ukraine national anthem as soon as our season reopened. We had been on a hiatus and as soon as it reopened, the very first production that played, I think it was on February 26th or 7th, we played the Ukrainian national anthem. Within a few weeks, we had organized a big concert event at the Metropolitan Opera in support of Ukraine with Ukrainian artists and featuring Ukrainian music. We were played a fundamental role in establishing the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra, made up of the leading Ukrainian instrumental performers from different opera houses and symphony orchestras in Ukraine who couldn't play, of course, in the early parts of the war. Still are very challenged, when half the concerts end up not taking place because of bombings these days. But over the summer, last summer, we formed, with the help of the Polish National Opera and the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture, the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra, which was made up primarily of musicians from Ukraine, as well as Ukrainian refugees who had left the country, and some Ukrainian musicians who had left earlier to become parts of European ensembles. And this orchestra, led by my wife, Carrie Lynn Wilson, the conductor, who is of Ukrainian descent, toured triumphantly across Europe, playing in many of the top music festivals, from the London Proms to Berlin to Munich to Edinburgh to ultimately concerts in New York and the Kennedy Center, and brought a lot of attention to the Ukrainian plight. And because we all know that Putin and the whole history of Russia, I've worked with Russia over many, many decades on cultural projects. Russia views its culture and its cultural performers as part of messaging the importance of Russian life to the world. Culture is a very strong propaganda tool. And Putin was very purposefully not only planning to crush Ukraine, but to crush Ukrainian culture. And so by creating this orchestra, we were showing Putin that Ukrainian culture was not so easily crushed, and that it would flourish in spite of his efforts.
Well, one of the most highly publicized things you did to implement your conviction was you fired Anna Netrebko. Now, Anna Netrebko was probably the premier soprano who sang at the Met over the past several years. She was a star, and no question about it. But she was also very close to Putin. She said that she wanted to sleep with Putin, said that publicly, and refused to renounce Putin, even though she was born in Russia, but she became an Austrian citizen. And you fired her. Now, how has that played out? And how did you come to that decision, and what has been the aftermath?
Well, she didn't actually say she wanted to sleep with Putin. She
said it would be fun.
She said that she hadn't slept with him, but she wouldn't mind if she had. She there's no question she had been the greatest star in opera at the Met. In fact, early on in her career, when I first started in 2006, I made a point of reaching out to her. I remember meeting her in Austria and making a deal with her to whereby she would be singing, she would become the leading prima donna at the Met, that we would give her multiple productions every year to sing, that she would be featured in our movie theater transmissions, which are kind of a great artistic status symbol at the Met, to be starring in our programs that are transmitted live to cinemas around the world. In fact, she performed and was featured in more of those cinema transmissions than any other Met artist. But clearly, because she was unwilling to separate herself from Putin, and we're not asking Russian artists who appear at the Met to sign, declarations against Putin or anything. It's just her association with him was so obvious, and it was so apparent. It seemed to me to be so apparent that, and based upon various actions she had taken, that she needed, in my opinion, to separate herself from him in order to convince the Met and the public who goes to the Met that she was not in favor of the war against Ukraine. And her unwillingness to do so left us with no choice but to sever our relationship with her. Interestingly, just this week, President Zelensky sanctioned about 100 or 200 Russian citizens, and she was on the list of people who have been sanctioned by Ukraine for their anti-Ukrainian activities.
But there were other Russian artists as well who you broke relations with. You broke relations with the Mariinsky.
Well, the Mariinsky, actually, we hadn't really, at the time of the invasion, we no longer had a relationship with the Mariinsky.
So you broke relations retroactively?
Well, we didn't need to break them because Valery Gergiev, the leader of the Mariinsky Opera House, and who far more than Netrebko has been really almost like a cultural minister to Putin. He has led victory concerts in Georgia and in Chechnya and in the Crimea. He is, clearly is aligned with Putin in his belief that Ukraine belongs to Russia. He said it on numerous occasions to people I know very well and to me. So as an artist, quite frankly, we had stopped working with him, not because of his political beliefs, but because of his artistically, he seemed much more kind of interested in just working on projects in Russia, and we came to the conclusion that he wasn't really right for the Met as a conductor before the invasion.
What about other opera houses? I mean, Covent Garden comes to mind, the opera company in Germany and Bavaria, and Zurich. Did they sever relations with Russian artists as well?
Well, first of all, I should say that we have not severed relations with Russian artists. We believe very strongly in Russian artists and Russian art. And I know this in Ukraine, they really, because they're fighting a war for their survival, they've taken a very black and white viewpoint that for them, anything Russian is unacceptable until the war is won. We have a somewhat more, significantly more nuanced viewpoint. I mean, I cannot blame Tchaikovsky for Putin's sins.
Well, Putin wasn't alive when Tchaikovsky was around.
Right, exactly. So, in fact, last March, on the very day that Putin was denouncing the West for, in one of his typical untrue statements, he was denouncing the West for canceling Russian culture. We were opening a run of Eugene Onegin that very evening with several major Russian artists performing leading roles, including Golovatenko, the Russian baritone who was singing the title role of Onegin. So, we, on the one hand, we do not believe in at the Met, we believe in Russian culture, we believe in great Russian art, and we believe in the innocent Russian artists. I mean, I think they all have to make choices about whether they want to stay in Russia or not stay in Russia. Some of them can't make those choices. Some of them have to stay in Russia. They have to live, and they have families there. And we're not trying to hold them hostage to their personal beliefs. We want them to be able to perform at the Met.
So is it fair to say the policy is no cancellation but selective severance?
Well, I think the policy is, as I said in an interview back in the spring, is that we want to cancel Putin, not Pushkin. That we do not believe in making Russian artists or great Russian art suffer or being canceled because of Putin being a monster. As far as the other opera companies in the world are concerned, many of them initially fired Netrebko. Many of them now have invited Netrebko back. Covent Garden has not. I believe Covent Garden is has held the line as we have.
Well, in the course of your implementing the policy, you sustained this devastating cyber attack. Did it cross your mind that the Russians may have been seeking vengeance for your severing ties with certain Russian artists?
The thought crossed my mind fleetingly, but I realized that if Putin was spending his time seeking revenge on opera companies, it was no wonder that he was losing the war. What we've been told by law enforcement officials and computer experts who deal with cyber attacks is that this is most likely the work of there are several criminal organizations working out of Europe that prey on companies in America and Europe, and it's happening all the time. It just happens that we're an opera company and one that is anti-Russian.
Well, one cyber expert quoted in the New York Times said that the culprits, that all the characteristics of a cyber attack coming out of Russia or Eastern Europe, doesn't mean it was state-sponsored, doesn't mean that Putin sponsored it, but certainly the cyber attack wouldn't have made Putin unhappy.
Well, it's interesting because the motivation behind most of these cyber attacks is monetary, and although the FBI is very careful about making it clear that it's illegal to negotiate or enter into any sort of business transaction with a cyber attack ransomware situation.
So you never paid ransom?
We have not paid ransom.
And what was the effect of the attack? Your box office was down for how long?
Our box office was down for 8 or 9 days, which was certainly during the height of the holiday ticket selling season. So that was not a good thing by any means. Although we did manage still to sell out our run of our family run of the English Magic Flute. And our other performances in December fared fairly well in spite of the fact that we had no box office. The box office came back online and ticket sales were brisk after that. But we're still, it takes weeks and weeks to get all of your systems back up and running after a cyber attack.
So how does an opera company function with its box office down? I mean, suppose I went up to the window and said, I'd like a ticket in the orchestra. What do I get? A piece of paper that says orchestra ticket?
Well, what we did
Jim
was
Zirin?
we created a workaround, which was for those days when we couldn't sell tickets. We created a special general admission pass for $50. Which was a great bargain for those people who ended up getting to sit in the orchestra for seats that normally would cost hundreds of dollars. And this general admission pass, which we made available, we had this rather crude workaround, which was that we would seat everyone who had tickets that were bought before the cyber attack, and then the people with the general admission tickets would be online waiting to fill the empty seats that were available. So that's how we got by for those 8 days.
Well, it's marvelous you did. There are reports that you have, because of COVID and because of the cyberattack and because of the economy generally, that admissions have fallen off, and you recently had to dip into your endowment, the extent of 10% of the endowment, in order to keep going. Do you expect to replenish the amount that you took from the endowment, and how is that going to work out?
Well, you know, when the pandemic began in spring of 2020, we knew that we were going to be financially squeezed. And, you know, opera, as we know, is not exactly a good business model to begin with, where even before the pandemic, we had to raise about half of our annual $300 million operating budget in the form of donations, and the rest came from earned revenue at the box office and our movie theater transmissions. So when the pandemic began, first of all, we were shut down for a year and a half, and we had no revenues, but of course our expenses were much lower as well. When we came back...
Well, you did have some revenues because you could subscribe with a credit card to one of your virtual productions.
True. I mean, but it was very minimal compared. It was a very minimal...
Not several $100s
a minimal revenue stream. But we certainly kept the interest of opera lovers alive by offering free streams to our operas from our vast library, and we have Met Opera on Demand, which is the service I think you're referring to, which you can subscribe to, which we have about 35,000 subscribers. But it was, you know, a drop in the bucket compared to what our box office and movie theater revenue typically is. We also, you know, saved money, and that was why we had to furlough many of our union members. We paid their medical benefits, but we had to furlough them. When we came back, suddenly our expenses were back up to normal, but our revenue was not. So we had we knew this was going to be a problem, and we raised more money from donations than we ever have before in history. But the trouble was that although we ended the year, our fiscal year ends at the end of July, we ended the year with a balanced budget on paper. We were short on cash because with all the donations that came in, many of them had cash earmarked for later years, and because of the stock market instability and decline, our very generous donors were more cautious about shelling out cash to us when we needed it. They made commitments, but without the cash.
So we're rapidly running out of time, but I thought you should certainly talk about your new productions, because that was one of the solutions to the problem.
Right. Well, I think, you know, the path forward for opera is an ancient art form, and the path forward for opera is renewal, artistic renewal. And we have found remarkably in the last couple of seasons that the new works that we are commissioning, new works that are accessible and appealing to audiences who can relate to the stories in terms of their own lives. Operas like The Hours that just had a very successful run, the adaptation of the Michael Cunningham novel and later film. Terence Blanchard's Fire Shut Up in My Bones, his upcoming opera Champion. New productions of Dead Man Walking, the Malcolm X opera X, the Spanish language opera Florencia and El Amazonas. These are all operas that are selling actually today better than the traditional classics, because our core...
Aida, Bohème, Traviata.
Well, I mean, there's always room for these great operas. They're timeless, they're works of genius. But the difference for the Met going forward is going to be a ratio of new work to older classics that's greater than ever before. So we will be presenting more new works than ever before in the history of the Met in the coming seasons. Next season, in fact, we have 6 contemporary operas, 4 of which are getting their Met premieres, 2 of which are coming back. The Hours, with its same cast of Renee Fleming, Joyce DiDonato, and Kelly O'Hara, and Fire Shut Up in My Bones. So that represents almost a third of our season.
What are you going to open with next season?
Dead Man Walking.
Dead Man Walking.
New production by Ivo van Hove, starring Joyce DiDonato.
That's about capital punishment.
It is about capital punishment.
So I have a question for you, Peter Gelb. In closing, what is your prognosis for the Metropolitan Opera?
My prognosis is cautious optimism. I believe that, of course, you never know with the health crisis and world events, but I think that we're on the right artistic course, that we have found a way forward that will bring new, diverse, younger audiences to the Met. We've proven we can do that. And I think opera has a real future because of that.
That's the future of the opera: world events and circumventing health crises.
And artistically having a winning formula.
Yeah, you are cutting back on productions generally, aren't you?
No, we're cutting back on revivals of operas that don't sell. We're adding operas that do sell, and by selling I mean ones that are going to capture the imagination of a broader public. We can no longer rely upon the older core opera audience. They have dwindled through age and attrition. And in fact, one very encouraging sign of the opera is that the average age of an opera attendee this year at the Met is 52 years old. That's down from 60s when I first got there.
Younger next year.
Every year.
Every year. So Peter Gelb, thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care, be well, and all the best.